welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. Hey, friends. We're working our butts off to bring you this content, just for your entertainment. If you like what you see, here's a deal: instead of offering us tea, just hit that subscribe button. It's way easier, totally free, and honestly makes us just as happy. Let's begin the story for you. I was born into a family where people didn't talk about feelings unless something broke. My father was the kind of man who could fix a sink, rebuild an engine, and silence a room with a look, and my mother was the kind of woman who kept the peace by smoothing everything over until even her own opinions seemed to disappear under the shine. I learned early that being loved was often the same as being convenient. I was a good kid by the standard we used: quiet, helpful, clean shoes on Sunday, and a face that could look calm even when my stomach was doing cartwheels. When I try to trace the first time I sensed that a boy wasn't a complete description of me, I don't find a big cinematic moment. I find small ones. The way I lingered near the laundry basket when my mother folded clothes, not because I wanted to help but because there was something soothing about fabric moving through her hands. The way I watched my aunt put on lipstick in the bathroom mirror at Thanksgiving, not because I thought she looked pretty, though she did, but because the act itself felt like a kind of decision, like she was choosing a version of herself and letting the world see it. The way I'd noticed the difference between how adults spoke to my sister and how they spoke to me, as if softness was permitted to her and borrowed only briefly by me. I didn't have words for any of that. I had a body, a set of expectations, and the unspoken rules of a house where the air seemed to thicken around anything outside the ordinary. I absorbed those rules the way kids absorb the smell of their home, without questioning, because it's the only atmosphere you know. In middle school, the social world became a small country with strict borders. Boys were supposed to be loud, careless, and hungry in every sense. Girls were expected to be composed and examined. Any sign that you crossed those lines was treated like a joke at best and a threat at worst. I learned to keep my curiosity private, to bury it under normal hobbies and a smile that said I wasn't difficult. I also learned, quietly, to perform masculinity like a job: lower your voice, don't gesture too much, laugh at certain jokes, pretend not to care about appearance while caring desperately about not being singled out. Yet the curiosity didn't vanish, it only changed shape. It became a kind of mental itch. Sometimes it surfaced in dreams where I wasn't a woman exactly but simply unguarded. In those dreams, I didn't feel like I was stealing anything. I felt like I had finally stopped holding my breath. High school offered more freedom and more surveillance at the same time. There were clubs, theater kids who seemed to live in a different universe, and a few brave souls who challenged the script. But in my corner of life, sports, part-time work, the group of friends whose teasing had sharp edges, the unwritten rule was still the same: don't give anyone a reason to question you. I did what many people do when they fear being misunderstood: I overcorrected. I dated girls, I practiced a shrug that implied I didn't care what anyone thought, I cultivated a version of myself that looked like the safest answer to every question. The truth is, I did care. I cared so much it sometimes felt like pain. I wanted to be seen, but I was terrified of what a scene might cost me. And because I didn't know how to handle that contradiction, I did what I'd been trained to do: I compartmentalized. I put parts of myself into locked rooms and pretended those rooms didn't exist. In college, I left home and discovered that the world was bigger than the rules I'd grown up with. People experimented with style, with identity, with ideas, and many of them did it openly. I envied them in a way that surprised me. I told myself it was admiration, or that I simply respected their confidence, but deeper down I recognized something more personal: they were giving themselves permission. It was in college that crossdressing, as a concept, stopped being a distant punchline and became a real, human thing. I met a person in a literature class, soft-spoken, thoughtful, who sometimes wore eyeliner and sometimes didn't, who refused to explain themselves to anyone who demanded a label. They weren't trying to shock anyone. They weren't asking for attention. They simply looked like themselves, whatever that meant on a given day. Something in me loosened every time I saw them, like a knot I didn't realize I'd been holding. I didn't immediately act on anything. I kept my locked rooms locked. But I started reading quietly, about gender norms, about how culture assigns meaning to clothing, about the difference between expression and identity. I learned that crossdressing can be many things: exploration, comfort, performance, sometimes a step toward understanding a deeper gender identity, and sometimes simply an aspect of personal expression that doesn't need to be tied to anything else. That variety should have made me feel free. Instead, it made me anxious, because it meant I could no longer hide behind a single, simple explanation. If it wasn't one thing, then what was it for me? My first private experiment happened almost by accident. A roommate went home for a weekend, and the dorm room was quiet. I was doing laundry and found, mixed in with my clothes, a simple thrift store skirt I'd bought as part of a costume idea for a party I never attended. It wasn't even something particularly feminine in the way people imagine. It was just fabric and a zipper. I remember staring at it and feeling my heart speed up as if I'd found contraband. I told myself I was only curious, only proving something to myself. I also told myself I wouldn't like it, that the moment I put it on I'd feel ridiculous and stop thinking about it forever. I put it on. The fabric settled differently on my body than anything I usually wore. The sensation was subtle, but it made me aware of my legs, of movement, of the way I occupied space. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a woman. I saw a young man in a skirt. And yet something in me softened. Not in a sexual way, there was nothing erotic about it. It felt more like relief, like taking off a heavy backpack you didn't realize you'd been wearing all day. I stood there for a long time, turning slightly, watching how the fabric moved, feeling a quiet calm that I had never learned how to ask for. Then, as quickly as that calm arrived, shame followed. I yanked the skirt off as if it might burn me. I folded it, shoved it into the bottom of a drawer, and spent the rest of the weekend trying not to think about it. That pattern repeated in different forms for years: curiosity, brief relief, then guilt, then suppression. The guilt wasn't just about what I'd done. It was about what it might mean, and about the fear that meaning would make demands on my life I didn't feel prepared to meet. I graduated, got a job, moved into an apartment that felt too quiet, and tried to become the person I thought adulthood required. I learned to talk about work in a steady voice. I learned to make eye contact in meetings. I learned to say, "I'm good," when someone asked how I was, even when I wasn't. I started dating more seriously, and in time I met the woman who became my wife. When I describe her, I have to be careful not to turn her into a symbol in my story. She is a whole person, and part of the moral responsibility of telling this is acknowledging that my identity exploration didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a relationship where trust mattered, where another human being had her own boundaries, fears, hopes, and needs. She was the first person I loved who didn't treat vulnerability like weakness. She listened in a way that made room for silence. She had a dry sense of humor and a steady way of seeing through pretense without humiliating you for it. She also had an artist's relationship with appearance, not in a vain way, but in a curious way. She could spend 20 minutes comparing 2 shades of eyeliner and treat it like a science experiment, then go hiking the next day without caring if her hair looked perfect. She had range, and she gave other people permission to have range too. For a long time I didn't tell her about my locked rooms. I told myself I would, eventually, but that I needed to be more certain first. That was my favorite excuse: I'll share it when I understand it. The problem with that logic is that understanding often comes through sharing, through being witnessed safely. So instead, I tried to carry it alone. I don't want to paint myself as noble for that. Some of it was fear, but some of it was also control. If I kept it hidden, I could decide when and how it existed. I could keep my marriage safe from uncertainty, at least on the surface. But the hidden parts of us don't stay quiet forever. They leak into our moods, our distance, our irritability, our sense that something is missing even when everything looks fine. The night I told her wasn't dramatic. That's one of the things I've learned: the most important moments in a life often happen in ordinary lighting. We were folding laundry together, the same simple activity that had been the backdrop of my earliest curiosity as a kid. She was humming softly, and I felt a sudden wave of tenderness for her that hurt. I remember thinking, if I can't be honest with this person, I'm not living my own life. My voice shook when I started. I tried to frame it carefully, as if the right explanation could prevent pain. I told her that sometimes, privately, I felt drawn to clothing that wasn't considered for men. I told her I didn't fully understand why. I told her it wasn't about anyone else, and it wasn't about wanting to leave, and it wasn't about wanting to deceive her. I told her I was ashamed and tired of being ashamed. She didn't react the way I'd feared. She didn't laugh. She didn't accuse me. She didn't make it about herself in a panicked way. She looked at me for a long time and asked a question that surprised me. Does it make you feel more like you, or less like you? I didn't know how to answer. That's the honest truth. Because part of me felt more like myself, and part of me felt like I was violating a rule that had kept me safe. My identity felt like two people gripping the same steering wheel. She didn't force an answer. She said, "Okay. We can take it slow. But you don't have to be alone with it." In the weeks that followed, we talked in fragments. I learned how hard it is to speak clearly about something you've trained yourself to hide. Every sentence felt like I was stepping onto thin ice. She asked what I was afraid of. I said I was afraid she would see me differently. She said, "I already see you differently than everyone else does. That's what being close is." She asked if I felt like a woman. I said I didn't know. I said I felt like a person who had been holding a part of himself behind his back for a long time. She nodded and said, "Then let's look at it together, not like a problem, but like a part of you." It would be comforting if the story went from that moment straight into acceptance and peace. That's not how it worked. Even with her support, I wrestled with self-judgment. I worried about what it meant for our marriage, for how others might perceive us, for my job, for my family. I worried that if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop, as if clothing had the power of addiction. I worried that I was making my wife responsible for something she hadn't signed up for. I worried that I was asking her to be a caretaker for my confusion. She surprised me again by establishing boundaries early, not in a cold way but in a thoughtful way. She said she was open to exploring with me, but she wanted honesty, and she wanted us to check in emotionally, and she didn't want either of us to use this exploration to avoid other issues. She said, "If we do this, it has to be grounded. No hiding, no spiraling, no using it to punish yourself." That was the first time I realized that moral responsibility in identity exploration isn't just about not hurting others, it's also about not hurting yourself with secrecy and contempt. The moment she first introduced changes, clothes, makeup, and behavior, came later than people might expect, and it happened in a way that still feels vivid when I close my eyes. It was a Saturday afternoon. The kind of day that's neither special nor empty, just open. We had done errands, cleaned the apartment, and made a late lunch. The sunlight was coming through the blinds in stripes. She was in the bedroom, and I was in the living room pretending to read while my thoughts circled the same question: what if I disappoint her? What if I disappoint myself? What if I open a door and can't close it? She called my name, gently, like she was inviting me to taste something. I walked into the bedroom and saw that she had laid a few items on the bed. Not lingerie, not anything provocative, just everyday pieces, a soft sweater in a neutral color, a pair of jeans cut differently than mine, a simple camisole, and a cardigan. Next to them was a small makeup bag, the kind she used when we traveled, and a hairbrush. Everything looked ordinary, which made it more intense. If it had been a costume, I could have dismissed it as play. This looked like a possibility. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About wanting to feel more like you. And I wondered if part of the fear is that you only imagine extremes. Like you have to jump from one cliff to another. What if it's just a few steps?" My mouth went dry. I remember staring at the clothes and feeling two opposite sensations at once. One was panic, the way your body reacts when it thinks you're about to be exposed. The other was something like excitement, but quieter than that, more like a pulse of life in a place that had been numb. It was the subtle thrill of being offered permission, and it frightened me because it felt good. I said something stupid, a reflex. "We don't have to do this." She didn't argue. She just said, "We don't have to. But I'm here. And I want to know you." I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs. In my head, a chorus of old voices started up. Don't be ridiculous. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't make your wife regret marrying you. Don't become a joke. Don't become a problem. Those voices were familiar, they had kept me as safe for years. But they had also kept me small. She sat beside me, not touching at first, giving me space. Then she asked, "What's the worst thing you imagine happening right now?" I said, "That I'll look wrong. That I'll look like I'm trying to be something I'm not." She nodded. "You might. Because you're learning. But looking awkward isn't a moral failure. It's just awkwardness." That sentence did something to me. I realized how often I treated discomfort as evidence that I was doing something unethical. I had confused social risk with moral wrong. And I had been punishing myself for years for wanting softness. She picked up the sweater and held it out, not like a dare, but like an offering. "Try this. Just this." My hands shook when I took it. I went into the bathroom to change because the idea of changing in front of her felt too exposed. In the mirror, I looked the same as always, stubble, tired eyes, shoulders held a little too tight. I took off my shirt and put on the camisole first. The fabric was light, and it made me suddenly aware of how heavy my usual clothes felt, like armor. Then I pulled on the sweater. It was soft. It fell differently on my torso. I stared at myself, waiting for disgust, waiting for laughter, waiting for the moment my brain would snap back into the normal. Instead, I felt a strange grief. Not because the sweater was magic, but because it reminded me of how long I denied myself simple comfort out of fear of other people's opinions. I thought about the boy I'd been, absorbing rules without consent, and I felt a tenderness for him that I'd never allowed myself. When I came out of the bathroom, my wife didn't clap or make a big deal. She just looked at me and smiled in a way that was gentle and real. "You look comfortable," she said. The word comfortable landed deeper than any compliment. I swallowed hard and nodded, because speaking felt like it might crack something open. She asked if I wanted to try the jeans. I hesitated, then did. The waistband sat differently. The cut changed my silhouette slightly. It wasn't dramatic. But the accumulation of small differences made me feel as if I had stepped into a version of myself that I hadn't rehearsed. That was terrifying. It was also honest. Then she said, "Can I do your makeup?" "Just a little. Not to turn you into someone else. Just to see what happens when you let yourself be cared for in that way." That question brought up another layer of emotion I hadn't expected. Makeup wasn't just makeup to me. It was associated with a type of attention I'd never received. It was associated with permission to care about appearance without being mocked. It was associated with femininity as a social language, one I'd been told I wasn't allowed to speak. I nodded, and my throat tightened. She had me sit on a chair by the window where the light was better. She didn't rush. She explained what she was doing as she went, the way you would with someone new, not in a patronizing way but in a calming way. A little concealer to soften the shadows under my eyes. A touch of tinted moisturizer because my skin was uneven from shaving. She brushed my eyebrows lightly, not changing their shape, just taming them. Then she paused, holding an eyeliner pencil, and asked again, "Is this okay?" I said yes, but my body said something else. My shoulders were rigid, my hands clenched. She noticed and set the pencil down. "Breathe," she said. "You're not doing anything wrong." That was the moment I almost cried, because I realized how deeply I'd internalized the idea that softness was suspicious. She was offering me something simple, and my nervous system was reacting like I was committing a crime. When she finally applied the eyeliner, it was subtle, more like definition than drama. She stepped back and studied my face thoughtfully, like an artist seeing a familiar subject in new light. Then she smiled. "There you are," she said softly. I didn't know what she meant, and yet I felt seen in a way that startled me. It wasn't that I suddenly looked like someone else. It was that I looked like myself with fewer defenses. The makeup didn't create a new identity. It revealed how much I'd been hiding. Then came the behavior piece, the part that I hadn't expected to be the hardest. She didn't tell me to act like a woman. She didn't give me stereotypes to perform. She simply started speaking to me differently, not condescendingly, not in a fake voice, but with a different rhythm. She asked me to walk with her to the kitchen and make tea. She asked me to slow down. She asked me to notice how my body felt moving through space in those clothes. She said, "You don't have to take up less space. Just take up space differently, if that makes sense. Like you're not bracing for impact." I tried, and it felt awkward. I caught myself hunching, trying to disappear. She corrected me gently, not smaller. Softer. There's a difference. That sentence became one of the most important lessons of my life. I had spent years confusing softness with weakness, and weakness with danger. But softness, I learned, can be strength. It can be the courage to be present without aggression. It can be the willingness to be vulnerable without collapsing. As we made tea, I felt waves of sensation, embarrassment, relief, fear, a quiet happiness that I didn't trust yet, and underneath it all a question that kept returning: what does this mean? Not in a dramatic, headline way, but in the practical way of a life. What does it mean for my marriage? For my sense of self? For the way I move through the world? I looked at my wife and saw the seriousness in her kindness. She wasn't playing with me. She wasn't trying to control me. She was offering structure to an exploration that might otherwise have turned into chaos. That day, she wasn't making me into her creation, in a possessive sense. She was helping me encounter myself through her care, and yes, it felt like I was being shaped. It felt like someone was sculpting away the fear, revealing a form I'd kept hidden. The shock was not just in seeing myself differently, it was in realizing I had wanted someone to guide me, to say it was safe enough to try. I wish I could say that after that afternoon, everything became easy. It didn't. The next day I woke up with a hangover of emotion. Shame crept in again, whispering that I'd crossed a line. I worried I had burdened my wife. I worried that enjoying that experience meant I was obligated to make big declarations. I worried that if I didn't make big declarations, I was being dishonest. My brain wanted a verdict. It wanted to classify me so the anxiety would stop. This was the first phase of my development, though I didn't call it that then: confusion. Not confusion as ignorance, but confusion as the mind's resistance to complexity. I was learning that identity can be layered and that layers don't always align neatly. Confusion is uncomfortable, but it can also be a sign that you're finally telling the truth. The second phase arrived as discovery, but discovery doesn't always feel like joy. Sometimes it feels like paperwork for the soul. My wife and I began setting aside time, once every couple of weeks at first, to explore in small, grounded ways. We treated it like an experiment in self-understanding, not as a secret indulgence. We agreed to check in afterward. How did it feel? What thoughts came up? What fears? What did it give you, and what did it take? I learned that sometimes I wanted to dress in a more feminine way simply because it allowed me to relax. Other times it brought up sadness, because it highlighted how rigid my life had been. Sometimes it made me feel connected to my wife, like we were sharing a language. Other times it made me feel lonely, because I realized she could take off her femininity without consequence in a way I couldn't. That wasn't her fault. It was society, and it was the years of internalized rules I carried. We also learned to separate different questions. There was the question of gender identity, who I am. There was the question of gender expression, how I present. There was the question of social role, how others perceive me. And there was the question of relationship, how we make choices together. Those questions overlap, but they are not the same. That distinction helped me breathe. In that discovery phase, I also learned about consent in a broader sense. My wife's involvement was supportive, but it had to remain mutual. We talked honestly about her feelings too. Sometimes she felt protective. Sometimes she felt uncertain. Sometimes she worried about what it meant for our future. When she voiced those worries, I had to resist the urge to interpret them as rejection. I had to learn that her honesty was part of our safety. The third phase was fear, and fear is where many people stop. Fear has a convincing voice. It says you're being selfish. It says you're risking everything. It says you'll be ridiculed. It says you'll be abandoned. Fear also says that if you just behave, if you just lock the door again, you can return to the version of life that looks normal from the outside. Our fear became more tangible when we started discussing whether this part of me would ever exist beyond our home. Not because I wanted to go out dressed as a thrill, but because I realized that keeping it entirely private was starting to feel like another kind of shame. I didn't want to make public spectacle of myself. I didn't want attention. I wanted authenticity, and that sometimes includes being honest in more than one room. But there were real risks. I worked in an environment where people made casual jokes about men who were too feminine. My family had never shown much flexibility around gender norms. I didn't want to become the topic of whispered conversations or the reason my wife felt scrutinized. I didn't want to lose my job. I didn't want to invite harm. So we made careful choices. We started with small steps that were more about internal truth than external display. A skincare routine I didn't hide. A neutral nail buff, not polish, just care. A softer sweater that could pass as unisex. A slightly different cut of jeans. Things that didn't announce anything but allowed me to practice being less rigid. This might sound trivial, but it taught me something. Integration often begins in the mundane. You don't become yourself in one dramatic leap. You become yourself through repeated, grounded permission. There was one evening when fear nearly won. We were invited to a friend's small gathering, people we trusted, kind people, but still. My wife suggested, gently, that I might wear a blouse-like top that wasn't obviously women's clothing but was more in that direction than I'd ever worn outside. The idea made my stomach drop. I imagined every eye turning toward me, every laugh, every awkward pause. I imagined my wife regretting it. I said no too quickly, with irritation. She didn't push, but I saw disappointment flash across her face, not because she wanted me to dress a certain way, but because she wanted me to have the courage to be honest. Later that night, I apologized. I told her the truth, I was scared, and when I'm scared, I become controlling. I tried to shut things down. She said, "Thank you for saying that. We can go at your pace. But I don't want fear to be the only thing steering our lives." That sentence became a turning point because it framed the ethical question clearly. The goal wasn't to prove anything or to perform. The goal was to make choices based on values rather than panic. My values were honesty, respect, and stability, not secrecy, avoidance, and self-contempt. The fourth phase, reflection, came through therapy. I want to mention this explicitly because mental health support is often treated as a last resort, and I've learned it can be a responsible first step. I found a therapist who had experience with gender expression and identity exploration, but who didn't force any narrative onto me. In those sessions, I learned that my shame wasn't evidence that I was wrong, it was evidence that I had been conditioned to fear being different. I learned to ask myself better questions than "What am I?" I learned to ask, "What do I need?" and "What helps me live with integrity?" and "What kind of husband do I want to be while I figure this out?" I also confronted the ways I had used masculinity as a shield. I had equated being a good man with being invulnerable. In therapy, I began to see that being a good man, being a good person, could mean being honest about fear, being accountable for my choices, and treating myself with the same compassion I offered others. My wife and I also learned practical coping strategies. We created language for check-ins: green, yellow, red. Green meant I felt grounded. Yellow meant I felt anxious, but okay. Red meant I needed to stop and regulate. We planned for the emotional aftermath, because exploration can stir up old pain. We prioritized sleep, exercise, and calm routines. We avoided making big decisions right after intense feelings. We treated my identity exploration as part of our life, not the entirety of it. That balance mattered. It kept us from turning the subject into a constant crisis. Reflection also brought grief. I grieved the years I spent hating myself for something that wasn't hurting anyone. I grieved the boy who learned to disappear. I grieved the idea of an easy life where I fit perfectly into everyone's expectations. That grief was real, and I had to honor it without letting it become a reason to give up. The fifth phase was acceptance, and acceptance didn't arrive as a grand revelation. It arrived as a quiet decision repeated many times: I will not treat myself like a problem. I will not use shame as a parenting tool on my own soul. I will be honest with my wife. I will respect her boundaries and my own. I will make choices that keep our life stable while still allowing me to breathe. Acceptance also meant tolerating ambiguity. I stopped demanding that I fit into a single label immediately. I gave myself permission to say, I'm exploring. I gave myself permission to be a man who sometimes expresses himself in feminine ways, without that automatically being a contradiction. I also gave myself permission to consider deeper questions without panic. Acceptance was not an endpoint, it was a posture. There was a night, maybe a year after that first afternoon in the bedroom, when my wife did something small that felt like a ceremony. We were getting ready for a quiet dinner at home. She asked, "Do you want to be more like you tonight?" The way she said it, simple, non-dramatic, made it feel normal. I said yes. She helped me with light makeup again, and I noticed something: my shoulders didn't tense as much. My breathing stayed steady. The old alarm system in my body was learning that nothing bad was happening. As she brushed my hair, she said, almost casually, "I'm proud of you." I asked why. She said, "Because you're choosing honesty over fear. That's hard. And it makes you kinder." That was another lesson I didn't expect. When I stopped fighting myself, I had more patience for other people. I became less reactive. I listened better. I felt less threatened by difference in general. Self-acceptance didn't make me self-absorbed, it made me less defensive. The sixth phase was integration, and integration is where life becomes practical again. It's where you stop asking for permission every time and start building routines that honor who you are. For us, integration meant deciding what stays private, what becomes shared with trusted people, and what simply becomes normal without announcement. We told a couple of close friends, carefully, not as a confession but as information. We chose people who had demonstrated empathy. We explained that this was about identity exploration and emotional health, not about shock or performance. We asked for discretion, not because we were ashamed, but because we wanted control over our own story. Their reactions were varied: some asked thoughtful questions, some needed time, some said, "Okay," and moved on, which was strangely healing. The world didn't end. Our friendships didn't collapse. A few became deeper because honesty tends to do that. With family, we went slower. I had to accept that not everyone would understand, and that my worth didn't depend on universal approval. I also had to accept that my wife's comfort mattered. We agreed that we wouldn't introduce this to family settings unless and until it felt safe for both of us. Integration wasn't about forcing visibility, it was about living with integrity. At work, I didn't make announcements. I simply softened certain edges over time. I dressed with more care. I allowed myself to be less performatively masculine. I stopped laughing along with jokes that dehumanized people. That was risky in a subtle way, but it was also a moral choice. I realized that if I wanted a world where I could exist safely, I had to contribute to making that world safer for others too. Integration also meant accepting consequences. Not dramatic consequences, but real ones. Sometimes I felt anxious in public, sometimes I censored myself, sometimes I felt angry that society polices clothing so intensely. Sometimes my wife and I had hard conversations about fear, about safety, about what we wanted our life to look like. We learned that integration doesn't eliminate conflict, it changes the kind of conflict you have. Instead of fighting yourself in silence, you negotiate with reality openly. I also had to confront the temptation to make my wife the director of my expression. That first afternoon, it had felt like living as her creation in the sense that she guided me, and I was grateful. But as time went on, I realized I needed agency too. Not because her guidance was wrong, but because relying entirely on her could become another form of hiding. Integration required that I learn my own tastes, my own boundaries, my own reasons. Sometimes that meant shopping alone and choosing something simple because it felt right, not because it fit an image. Sometimes it meant learning how to do basic makeup myself, not to replicate her skills, but to practice self-sufficiency. That was part of personal responsibility. If this was truly mine, I needed to carry it with my own hands, not place it entirely in hers. One of the most meaningful moments of integration happened when I caught myself speaking to myself differently. I was looking in the mirror one evening, wearing a soft cardigan and a bit of concealer, and I felt the old reflex rising. You look ridiculous. You're pretending. You're going to ruin everything. But then another voice answered, calmly, you're allowed to be a whole person. You're not hurting anyone. You're being honest. That second voice didn't erase fear. It simply refused to let fear be the judge. And that, I think, is what resilience looks like. Not bravado. Not denial. Just a steady willingness to keep choosing dignity. When I look back now, I don't see crossdressing as the headline of my life. I see it as one thread in a larger tapestry of identity, a way I learned to question inherited rules, to practice empathy, to communicate better, to become more emotionally literate. It taught me that clothing is never just clothing in a culture that assigns meaning to everything, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be seen in ordinary ways. It also taught me respect for people whose exploration carries higher stakes than mine, for people who face discrimination and danger simply for existing, for partners who navigate these changes alongside someone they love, for the slow work of building a life that can hold complexity without collapsing. I learned that the goal isn't to win approval. The goal is to live in a way that aligns with your values while honoring the lives connected to yours. If you're listening to this and you recognize pieces of yourself in it, I want to offer something practical, not romantic. Go slowly. Be honest with yourself without demanding immediate certainty. If you have a partner, treat them as a whole person in the process, not as an audience or a tool. Seek support if shame is swallowing you, therapy, trusted friends, community spaces that prioritize safety and respect. Pay attention to your mental health. Notice whether your exploration brings calm or chaos, and if it brings chaos, don't punish yourself, get help and adjust your approach. Identity isn't proven through intensity. It's clarified through care. And if you don't relate personally but you're trying to understand someone you love, I hope this shows that identity exploration, when done responsibly, is not inherently reckless or immoral. It can be a sincere attempt to live with less fear and more honesty. It can be an act of self-respect that leads to greater respect for others. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.